Om Shri Sai Ram. Hello students. Today we're very lucky to be discussing Two Deer. And Two Deer is a beautiful story written by Count Leo Tolstoy. Two, here we have the word two, which means a lot, more than a lot. It means excessive, extremely. And deer is a homonym. Homonym is a word that is spelled alike and sounds alike, but it depends on the usage in English, okay? Dear, we write letters to our mother, our father, our friends. We say, dear sir, dear mom, dear dad. But dear also means very expensive, okay? And this story by Count Leo Tolstoy is talking about the expense of taking care of a person. So, we're going to go through the text and through the story, but to bring you up to speed, I want to bring you up to some history of Count Leo Tolstoy. This count was born in the early 1800s, and he was a prolific writer. He wrote War and Peace. War and Peace is a novel. It's actually a realistic fiction. Tolstoy was known as the master of realistic fiction. And realistic fiction means it sounds true, but it's not actually true. It's based on all of the mores and customs of a country and of a civilization, but the names and the people are not actual names and people. But it sounds, and War and Peace is a beautiful novel that was written when Tolstoy was young. It has 587,000 words. To put this in perspective, the long epic called Ramayana only has 480,000 words. So this story is longer than the Ramayana, the story of War and Peace. So Count Leo Tolstoy wrote many, many, many stories and novels, and then he had a spiritual awakening. The spiritual awakening took place in about 1870. And the cause of the spiritual awakening was reading. He read the Bhagavad Gita. Once he read the Bhagavad Gita, the way he discussed everything and the way he wrote changed dramatically. And he was known as a moral thinker. And he wrote this particular book, a story that we're going to read, in 1897. In 1897, he was almost 70 years old. He had gone through a lot of life experiences, had done a lot of writing, and he wanted to give a social commentary on the country of Monaco. So if you turn to your books, you'll see that on the bottom of the page, well, first of all, here's a picture of Monaco in 1895. And in 1895, Monaco was only 2 square kilometers. And there's a picture on the right side, you can see a hill overlooking the ocean. And on top of this hill was what was called a gaming house, a casino. And I'll explain more about that. But this is the population at this time was only 7,000 people. And I'm showing you these pictures to show how it was nice, it was not crowded at that time. So now we'll go into the text. And near the borders of France, this little town is near the border of France and Italy, on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. The reason the Mediterranean Sea is important is that people could come by boat and they could gamble in Monaco. Many of small town has more people than 7,000. We have cities in France and in the United States and England, and especially in India, that have way more than 7,000 people. But that was the amount of people that were in Monaco at this time. And so the kingdom, if it was divided up into small parts for each person, there wouldn't be enough land for 1 acre for each person. It was a very small kingdom. And they called it a toy kingdom because it's so small, it's like a toy. And there was a real kinglet in this kingdom. All right, and because it's a small kingdom, they would sometimes call him a prince. So in the text, he goes back from prince to kinglet to king. And in this kingdom, okay, because he thought he was a king, he had a lot of people that he had hired. And in your book it says he had a palace, a nice palace to live in, and courtiers. Courtiers are the people that help him and the people that put the flowers on and make it really nice and for the king. And ministers. He would have a minister of finance, a minister of revenue, so many ministers he had. And he had a bishop. This is very important, because even though this whole kingdom was known for gambling, and this is how he made most of his money, at least God did not forsake this kingdom. There was one bishop. And a bishop is a person, he's an older member that studied the Bible or Christian texts for a long time, and he's put in charge of an area. And there was generals and an army. This small kingdom had an army. It was not a large army, only 60 men in all. But still, it's an army. And there are also taxes in this kingdom. To run a kingdom, you need to have money. So the way he got his money was by taxes. And like elsewhere, he had a tax on tobacco. If you're going to smoke cigarettes, you've got to pay a tax. And on wine and spirits, if you're going to drink alcohol, you're going to have to pay a tax. And this money helps to run the kingdom. And there was a poll tax in Monaco. A poll tax means every person in Monaco had to pay a certain amount of money to live in Monaco. And though there were people there that were drinking and smoking, as people do in other countries, there were so few of them that the prince was hard put to feed his courtiers and officials. He didn't have enough money with just tobacco taxes and with wine taxes. He had to get a special source of revenue. So what he did was he had a gaming house. Some people put up a gaming house, which is now called a casino, and where people play roulette. And if you can see on your picture there, I've shown a roulette wheel. And this roulette wheel has 37 spots, all right? Numbers from 1 to 36, and then a green spot there called 0. So, and then you can see also on the bottom of your picture, there's a table. So people would put their money, usually in the form of a chip, on a number, all right? And if they'd spin the wheel, and if the number came up, say you put your money on number 1. If number 1 came up, you would get 36 times the amount of money you put on the number 1. And so, but the house, they would always win with 0, okay? So even though you're gambling, you can never get 100% of your money back. 3%, almost 3% would go to the gaming house, the casino, and that's how they could provide everything. So people would come, and roulette is such an enticing gambling because you almost get a full amount of money, and some people would actually win money. And so if people win money, they think this is an easy way to win money. But gambling, as Tolstoy wanted to show people, was very dangerous. So the people play, okay, they play roulette. A lot of people come from all over Europe, and they would play on this roulette wheel at Monaco. And win or lose, the gaming house would make about 3%. If it was $1 million invested that day or gambled that day, the gaming house would have $30,000. And they would give about half of that to the prince to run this kingdom. People play, and whether they win or lose, they give a lot of profits to the prince. The reason he pays so much was because this was the only gaming house. This story was written in 1897, okay? All of the other countries decided not to have gaming houses at that time because the reason they stopped it was the gaming houses did a lot of harm to people. A man would come and try his luck, and he would risk all he had and lose it. And then he would even risk money that did not belong to him and lose that too. And then in despair, he would shoot himself, or he'd jump off of that hill I showed you where the gaming house was into the water and drown himself. And many people have killed themselves. In fact, there were so many people that killed themselves in the gaming house, they had a room downstairs called the morgue room. So if people lost their money and shot themselves, they would take the person down to the morgue room and eventually dispose of the body. So the Germans forbade their rulers to make money in this way. So because Germany and France and Italy, they did not have gambling establishments, everybody would come to Monaco. And so the prince had a monopoly on the business of gambling. And the prince, there was nobody to stop the prince from doing this. So everybody who wants to gamble now goes to Monaco. And the prince gains by it. Then there's a quote here in your book. It says, "You can't earn stone palaces by honest labor." The fact is, this prince is just pretending he's a king, okay? He's getting money from the tobacco and wine taxes and the poll tax, and most of his money comes from the gambling tax that he puts on the casino. So he has a castle, but he didn't build his castle himself. That's the reason for this proverb. And the king knows that this gambling is not a good business. He sees dead people all the time that have killed themselves from gambling. But what is he to do? He has to live and draw a revenue from drink and from tobacco is also not a nice thing. So he lives and reigns and rakes in the money and holds his court with the ceremony of a real king. He has his coronation. Every year or so he has a coronation for him and all of the ministers. He also has his levees. These are parties that he throws for the people that work for him. He rewards, sentences, and pardons. He also has his reviews, councils, laws, and courts of justice, just like other kings, but much smaller scale. Now, in this kingdom, everybody's pretty happy, except if they lose all their money, but the people that live there, they're very peaceful. And a few years ago, in 1896, a murder was committed in the toy prince's domains. The people of that kingdom are very peaceful. They don't do such a thing. In fact, I looked up in history, and the last murder before 1897 was in 1847. So for 52 years, nobody was killed or seriously harmed in Monaco. So the judges assembled, and they tried the case in a most judicial manner. There were judges and prosecutors and jurymen and barristers. They argued and they judged. And at last, they condemned the criminal to have his head cut off, as the law directs. If you're guilty of murder one, then the sentence was execution. So far, so good. Next, they submitted the sentence to the prince. They got done with the court. They went to the prince, said, "Here, king, we have to execute this guy." So the prince read the sentence, and he confirmed it. He says, "If the man must be executed, execute him." There was only one hitch. Hitch means a problem, okay, in the matter. And that was that they had neither a guillotine for cutting heads off, nor an executioner. You can say we have to kill this person, but it has to be killed in a proper manner. And at that time, especially in France, people who were sentenced to death would be killed by having their head cut off by a guillotine. A guillotine is a large knife on a big machine, and you put your head underneath it, and when the executioner prepares you, then he lets go with the knife cuts off your head, falls in a basket, and then they take care of your body. And it happens quickly, so the person doesn't suffer much. They die, but it's a nice, clean form of killing people. So, but they didn't have this in Monaco. Monaco's a small country. So ministers considered the matter, and they decided to address an inquiry to the French government. Now, address is another homonym. Address, when you're writing a letter, that's addressing a letter. When you have an address where they send letters to you, you have an address on your house. So it's used in two forms. So they wrote this letter to the French government, and they asked them if they could lend them a machine and an expert to cut off the criminal's head. And if so, would the French kindly inform them what it would cost? The letter was sent. A week later, the reply came. A machine and an expert could be supplied, and the cost would be 16,000 francs. Now, to put this in perspective, at that time, in 1897, a franc was worth about 10 US dollars, or about 700 rupees, okay? So 700 rupees times 16,000 is a lot of rupees. It's $160,000. This was laid before the king. He thought it over. 16,000 francs. The wretch is not a nice word to call somebody, but that's what he called this criminal. He called him, the wretch is not worth the money. Can't it be done somehow cheaper? Why, 16,000 francs is more than 2 francs a head on the whole population. The people won't stand for it. They may cause a riot. You see, the king is in a touchy spot. He has to have a nice kingdom, and he has to make it available and reasonable for all the people that he's ruling over. So he doesn't want to overtax these people. So he thought people will not settle for getting charged $20 or 140 rupees, okay, for cutting this man's head off. So he called together a council. In government, and this is what Leo Tolstoy is trying to show us in this book here, in this story, the government has so many councils, so many people that get together, so many commissions, committees, subcommittees. And he says that's a big waste of money. For a small thing like one prisoner, they had so many meetings, and the meetings, the ministers have to be paid. And what he is trying to do, since he had his social reform of reading the book, reading the story of the story of showing that you have to run your life in a positive manner, have good morals, don't overtax the people, love everybody. And this was shown when he read the story of Bhagavad Gita. So he called the council and said to them, look, we have to do something cheaper. This is too expensive. So he said, the king over here in Italy, okay, he's a brother monarch. Maybe he could be asked and do it somehow cheaper than the French government, which is a Republican government. So they wrote a letter to the Italian government, and a prompt reply was received. The Italian government wrote that they would have pleasure in supplying both a machine and an expert. The whole cost would be 12,000 francs, including travel expenses. Because France is right next door, Italy was a little further away. This was cheaper, but it still seemed too much. The prince cares about money, okay? He cares about rupees, he cares about dollars and francs. He cares about those more than he cares about the prisoner. So he called together another council. They discussed and thought about how they could do this for less money. And they thought, well, maybe we could get the army to take care of this guy. We'll get the army to kill this guy. Then we won't have to pay this 12,000 or 16,000 francs. So the general was called in and asked, can't you find us a soldier who will cut the man's head off? In war, they don't mind killing people. In fact, that's what they are trained for. So the general talked it over with the soldiers to see whether one of them would not undertake the job. But none of the soldiers would do it. No, they said, we do not know how to do it. It's not a thing we've been taught. First of all, it's not nice to kill people. And they're not in a war. It's not a righteous war. It's an execution. So they backed off, and they told the general, we're not going to do it. So the general came, told the prince. So what was to be done? Again, the prince called a meeting of the ministers, and they considered and reconsidered. They assembled a commission and a committee and a subcommittee. And at last they decided the best thing would be to alter this death sentence to one of imprisonment for life. The reason they suggested that is this would enable the prince to show mercy and would be cheaper. Instead of paying 16,000 francs, they would just have him in a lockup and feed him, and how much could it cost? So the prince agreed to this, and the matter was arranged. The only another problem, was they had no suitable prison. It was such a small kingdom. They had a small little room that they called a jail. In case somebody had done a small misdemeanor, they would be put in there for a day or so. But they didn't have a strong prison, because you have to keep this criminal in there for years, the rest of his life. And if it wasn't strong, he'd get out somehow. But they did manage to find a place finally, and they put a young fellow there as a guard. And the guard had to watch the criminal and had to fetch his food from the palace kitchen. There were so few kitchens at that time. The only place for food was basically the palace kitchen. So this prisoner is eating the same food that the king is eating. And so the prisoner is laying there in his nice room with nice food. The prisoner remained there month after month until a year had passed. But when a year had passed, the kinglet, the prince, looked over his accounting of his income and expenditures one day. And he noticed this new item, and this was for the keep of the criminal. And it was not a small item. There was a special guard. There was the man's food. It came to more than 600 francs a year. Very important. Look at these words, more than 600 francs. They don't say exactly, but it was more than 600 francs. And the worst of it was this was a young criminal, okay, he's in his 20s. He could live 50 more years. He's eating good food from the palace and not doing any work. So this was a serious matter. It would never do. The prince called his ministers again for another council. You must find some cheaper way of dealing with this rascal. The present plan is too expensive. The ministers met and considered and reconsidered until one of them said, "Gentlemen, in my opinion, we must dismiss the guard." But then another minister said, "But he'll run away. The fellow will run away." And the first minister said, "Well, let him run away and be hanged to him." In England, the way they would execute a person is they would hang him, okay? So there was always this saying, this expression, "be hanged to him." We don't care what happens to him. Let him be hanged. Let him go hang himself, okay? So they reported the result of their deliberations to the king. And he agreed with them. He said, "Okay, let the guard go." So the guard was dismissed, and they waited to see what would happen. All that happened was, at dinner time, the criminal came out, and not finding his guard, he went to the prince's kitchen to fetch his own dinner. He took the meal that was given to him, a nice meal, and he went back to his prison, shut the door, and stayed inside. The next day, the same thing occurred. He went for his food at the proper time, but as for running away, he did not show the least sign of wanting to run away. What was to be done? They considered the matter again. They met, and they said, "We have to tell this prisoner outright that we do not want to keep him." So the minister of justice had him brought before him. So the prisoner is brought in front of the minister of justice. The minister of justice says, "Why do you not run away?" said the minister. "There's no guard to keep you. You can go where you like, and the prince will not mind." So the prisoner looked at this minister and said, "I dare say the prince would not mind, but I have nowhere to go. What can I do? You have ruined my character by your sentence, and the people will turn their backs on me." It's very important. First thing the prisoner said was, "I have nowhere to go." The second argument he has is that because you've sentenced me as a murderer, okay, and everybody in Monaco knows that, nobody's going to give me a job. So when you have your tests on this material, these are two very important points you have to mention, okay? The third point you have to mention is the prisoner says, "I've been laying in the prison for a year now. I've gotten out of the way of working. I don't feel like working anymore. I'm getting nice food. I'm happy here." So that's his third argument. Not a good argument, but this is what he told to the minister. Then he said, in the first place, he says, "You've treated me badly. It's not fair. In the first place, when you sentenced me to death, you ought to have executed me, but you did not do it. That is one thing. I did not complain about that." So you can see Tolstoy is now showing the humor in this whole situation. Here this man killed somebody. Another story said he killed his wife. We don't know what the circumstances. But here he is, a murderer and sentenced to death, and now he's saying, "You didn't kill me." He was lucky they didn't kill him. They didn't have the guillotine. But he's saying this is one of the arguments he has for not leaving the prison. Then you sentenced me to imprisonment for life and put a guard over me to get my food. But after a time, you took him away, and I had to fetch my own food. So these are 5 arguments he's using, saying why I cannot leave the prison. Now you actually want me to go away? I can't agree to that. You may do as you like, but I won't go away. He is acting like a kitten, okay? And the prince is the mother cat. He's saying, whatever you do to me is fine, but I'm not going to leave. You're taking care of me. You're giving me nice food. You're giving me a place to stay. So the minister of justice goes and tells the prince what was to be done. The prince called another council. The council was summoned. What course should they adopt? The man would not go. They reflected and considered. They thought the only way to get rid of him was to offer him a pension. And so they reported this to the prince. They said, we have to give him a pension. We have to bribe him to get him out of the country. And the prince said, well, with the commissioners, they said, there's nothing else to it. We must get rid of him somehow. He has to go. So the sum was fixed at 600 francs. And this was announced to the prisoner. So 600 francs is just a little bit less than it would have cost them to keep them in the jail. Well, said the prisoner, I don't mind so long as you undertake to pay it regularly. Here, the prisoner is telling the prince, you've got to pay this pension regularly. Here he is, a murderer, a criminal, and he's telling the prince what he has to do. It's very humorous, and this is what Tolstoy is trying to get across. The prince cares much more about money than he cares about the prisoner, or he cares about any of the people that work there in Monaco. He's worried about money, and that's why this is called too dear. He's worried about francs in this case. So the matter was settled. The prisoner received 1/3 of his annuity in advance. Since he was getting 600 francs a year, they gave him 200 francs, all right? So with this amount of money, he emigrated. Emigrate means when you leave your country for another country, you emigrate to the next country. It was only a quarter of an hour by rail. He got on a train, went to the next country, which was France, and then he bought a bit of land. With his 200 francs, he was able to buy a small plot of land, and he started market gardening. He would grow tomatoes, or he would grow peppers, and he would sell these products that he grew. And then he would come to get his pension. Every 4 months, he would come to Monaco and get 200 francs. And he always goes at the proper time to draw his pension. When he receives this pension, okay, he goes to the gaming tables. He stakes 2 or 3 francs. Sometimes he wins, sometimes he loses. And then he returns home. He's a smart criminal. He doesn't gamble all the 200 francs. He gambles a few, and if he wins, he's happy. If he loses a couple francs, he's happy also. Now he goes back and does his market gardening. He lives peaceably and well. So then Tolstoy says, he sums up this whole story. He goes, it is a good thing that he did not commit his crime in a country where they do not grudge expense to cut a man's head off or to keep him in prison for life. The whole point of the story is the prince did not want to pay for this man at all. He wanted to keep the country, his kinglet, happy, but he didn't want to pay to rehabilitate this prisoner. So you show these 2 pictures, okay? So we have Monaco, and you can see that Monaco now has grown from 7,000 people to 40,000 people. And because they only have 2 square kilometers of land, they've had to build up. They've built up many high-rises, and they have started 3 more gambling houses or casinos. You can see from the pictures that Monaco is built up and it built out into the water. the harbor there had no boats in it back in 1895. And now they have hundreds and hundreds of boats, big yachts that are 150 feet long. And people stay there, they dock their boats, and they stay and they go into Monaco, gamble, have a good time. Stay for weeks, months, sometimes they just leave their boat there. So what has happened is that now there's a quarantine, and the quarantine has shut down these gaming houses. And Monaco itself now has no income coming in. So very interesting, Tolstoy was writing this book so that people would realize the negative side of gambling, okay? And not waste their money and time and sometimes kill themselves. But now what has happened is that this quarantine has shut down Monaco. There's no gambling there in Monaco. And people have to go back to a simpler way of lifestyle. They have to go back to doing market gardening or something like this prisoner had to do. So in the end, Tolstoy's social conditioning, what he was trying to do of helping people to live a better life, has now had to happen because of the quarantine. So, Om Sai Ram, thank you very much. Sai Ram.